Morning, colleagues. My paper is entitled Activism, Professionalism and Control, Policing, History Teacher Activism in England. And I'm going to read it. I'll keep the time of it. The response of the English Conservative government to Black Lives Matter in 2020 was not enthusiastic. One prominent minister chose to mock players taking the knee at football matches as, quote, a symbol of subjugation and subordination, arguing that it originated from the TV show Game of Thrones. The English Prime Minister chose to critique Black Lives Matter's protesters in 2020, but not to criticise far-right counter-protesters. Subsequent government action included advocating for a new specific offence to prohibit damaging war memorials and proposals to make defacing statues and monuments punishable by up to 10 years in jail. And this is the context where, as I argued in Public History Weekly in 2019, the government have a track record of seeking to rewrite history to create celebratory narratives of the British past that aim to minimise troubling aspects of our national history. There was little enthusiasm in the education community then, in 2022, when the English Department for Education published guidance on political neutrality in schools, drawing attention to what teachers could and could not do, to the organisations whose resources schools should not use, and to speakers they should not invite. What does this guidance see then as political? How does the document understand legitimate teacher agency when it comes to such matters? How closely do these understandings align with or contrast with how activist teachers see themselves? The document's understanding of political approximates to the following: views that are partisan or one-sided, and or views expressed to further the interest of a particular group, and or views expressed to change the law or government policy. The opposition between views and facts recurs a number of times throughout the document, suggesting that established facts are not political, but that views are. There are problems here, of course. Views, facts is a very flat binary. A fact is usually taken to mean a verifiable statement about an event or state of affairs, something that is the case, that has happened, and so on. For example, the statement, the moon does not have an atmosphere. There are many non-facts that cannot just be described as views, if views means subjective perceptions or ways of seeing things. There are, for example, warranted generalizations about the world, built from facts inductively. There are explanatory claims that can be defended with arguments. In addition, there are predictions based on inferences from past experience, some of which have more warrant than others on rational grounds, and so on. Where something is neither a fact or something that is widely agreed upon, the guidance says, it is to be taken as political and should be taught in a balanced way, by which the guidance means in a way that presents a number of different positions on the issue in a, quote, fair and dispassionate manner. Some examples can help clarify what is meant, perhaps. The guidance contains a number of scenarios that are used to help teachers understand the difference between matters that are political and matters that are not. In scenario A, for example, it is argued that teaching about what should be done about climate change is political, but that teaching the facts about climate change is not political. In scenario B, teaching about intervening in a humanitarian crisis is described as political. There could be different views about what should be done, but presumably, it's not stated, teaching that there was a crisis would not be political. In scenario D, it is explained that teaching about a political ideology, such as socialism, need not be political, but that teaching an ideology as fact or advocating it explicitly would be. In scenario I, it is stated that it would not be political to teach about racism and that racism has no place in our society, but about teaching about organizations like Black Lives Matter and about proposals such as the defunding of the police would be political, since it is not consensual and goes beyond, quote, the basic shared principle that racism is unacceptable. A number of the scenarios in the document are explicitly historical and demonstrate flaws in the facts, views dichotomy. Discussions of old history, such as the Renaissance or the Reformation, are unlikely to be political, scenario C said. But more recent history, such as the history of empire or imperialism, is more likely to be political and requires a balanced approach, the scenario argues. Scenario F advises that although political figures, aspects of whose lives might be controversial, can be discussed with older children in a balanced way, this may not be possible with younger children, who should just be presented with facts about such figures and taught about, quote, the things they are most renowned for. The first of these statements points to the limitations of thinking in terms of facts and views. Much of what might be considered controversial about the British Empire by our government would be treated as rationally defensible and warranted interpretation by many historians. Kim Wagner, for example, has argued that systematic violence is fundamental to British imperialism and not, as many believe, exceptional. This, Wagner would argue, is the most reasonable conclusion to draw from what we know about the history and operation of the empire. The idea of taking a balanced approach to empire is itself controversial, not least because the notion that there were benefits of empire originates in imperialism. The notion that we should focus on teaching young children things that historical figures are most renowned for might very well lead to not teaching them facts. Myths about historical leaders are often as common as facts, and sometimes more so. So far, we've explored this text largely in terms of what it says and in terms of the arguments it makes. We should also ask the question, what is being said in saying these things? Initial reactions to the text, for example, from teacher unions, interpreted the guidance as an attempt to reduce teachers' confidence in addressing issues such as climate change and racial injustice. The guidance would be likely, the argument went, to have a dampening effect. In other words, to stop teachers doing this because they would be too uncertain. The guidance can also be evaluated by contrasting it with what activist educationalists think they are doing. A clear subtext of the guidance is controlling activism. As we have seen, Black Lives Matter are referenced in the text, and climate activism is present. And there is also reference to women's groups. What does educational activism look like? And can it meaningfully be understood simply in terms of the one-sided advocacy of one-sided solutions to problems now or in the future in the way that the guidance suggests? I will answer this question by looking at one example of educational activism, the book Doing Justice to History from 2015 by two of my UCL colleagues, which I'll pass around for those in the room, which is available from all good bookstores for those online. But my colleagues explicitly advocate transformation. However, they are not arguing for a change in government policy, but for changes in narrative representation. School history, they argue, remains influenced by negative images of Africa and African history that cause it to ignore important aspects of the human past, or that cause it to represent African people in troubling ways. Oh, I've lost my smile. To represent African people in troubling ways, for example, in some schools, only as slaves, but not as kings or saints. In the book, they praise three categories of Black history activists: pugilists, diggers, and choreographers. And the book itself exemplifies all three by presenting historical material and advocating the planning of history lessons that foreground Black history. To quote from the book, policymakers in education have long deemed Black history undeserving of respect and reverence afforded to traditionally taught history. So we need pugilists to take up the struggle against the master narratives in history education and historical scholarship that exclude the histories of people from the African continent and the African diaspora over the past 2 millennia. Diggers devote themselves to researching and collecting important histories that have the power to challenge conventional thinking about Black history. They reveal its diversity, its intrigues, and the narratives of its obscuration. The matter of choreography brings us to the classroom of the history teacher. The teachers gather new subject material, balance its distribution across a sequence of lessons, and elicit meaning from their students. At issue then are the accepted facts themselves as much as any action to change policy. What is being challenged is the educational perpetuation of a distorted vision of the world. One can, of course, be balanced about the facts. Historical sources are often susceptible of more than one interpretation, and it is reasonable to consider as many interpretations as can reasonably be made of the historical record. This is not to say, however, that one should not challenge and dismiss inaccurate or rationally indefensible representations of the world. And this is what is at stake in educational activism, much more than the advocacy of sets of policy goals or changes in the law. To conclude, as well as perhaps acting in its effects to dampen the confidence of teacher activists, perhaps we can say that the guidance I've been exploring arguably misrepresents and misunderstands what teacher activism sets out to challenge. Thank you.
Okay.